Let's talk about race and ethnicity. If you think that those two words are interchangeable, go hand in hand, or you're like, what is the difference in race and ethnicity? The reason that you feel that way is probably because they are not at all based in science. They are completely made up by humans, and their relevance to any kind of social status is also completely made up. Boom, you just learned the definition of a social construct, something within society that we have created that we then deem important and something that we operate within. And in this case, something that becomes a part of our identity. So your race or race is based on physical differences amongst people, dating back to their ancestors' country of origin. We're not going to get into the reason that there's physical differences in racial groups for this class, but like your skin color, hair texture, sometimes body shape, height, facial features, those kind of things are the basis for our racial differences. Again, their importance completely made up by humans. Now, ethnicity is more of like your cultural heritage. It could be your just country of origin in general. It could be religious affiliation. It's more, when I say cultural, you've already learned about culture. So consider all the different pieces that go into culture. The way that you speak, your preferences in food and music, and all of those things can be a part of your ethnic identity. I'm not going to get into this class all of the different types of ethnicities, although there is an entire class on that. But consider for a second if, what you consider your own ethnic identity to be, your own ethnicity to be. When reflecting on this for myself, it's really difficult as someone who's white. Do we associate ethnicity with someone who is white? What ethnicity would we say? If we're considering a cultural heritage, perhaps you identify with some of the cultural heritage of your parents or, even ancestors. Mine are from Ireland and Scotland, my grandparents. Does that make me Irish? Is my ethnicity Irish? I wouldn't say so, because I don't affiliate or associate or identify with any of those cultural practices or know any of those people. They're not here anymore and have not influenced me. It's really interesting to think about, but we consider that box, just like, the race box, to be so important that you have to answer it on so many different papers that you fill out, so many different applications. And we really think it's really important. But it's just made up. It's a social construct. Now, that's not to say that different groups of people don't look differently or that different groups of people don't have a different shared cultural heritage. Of course they do. But in terms of ranking them, which one is more important or better at sports or better at academics or, any of those things, that's completely fabricated. And the origins of that are deeper than we're going to get into for this class, but it is important to know that it's a social construct. I also want to be sure to say that your own ethnic identity can absolutely be, the single most important identifier for yourself. And that is perfectly acceptable. The same could be said for your racial identity, gender identity. All of those could be the most important to you. And there's nothing wrong with that. The point I'm trying to make is that societally, we have decided that those racial identities, those ethnic identities are grouped together. And then if you share a particular heritage or physical features with, if there's a large number of people that fit into that category, then we have done just that, categorized them and said, these people do this thing and these people do this thing. And that is the part that is not based in science. The other words that are important that are often used interchangeably, prejudice and discrimination. Discrimination is a little easier because discrimination is an act of doing something to or against someone because of one of those categories that we think they fit in. Now, in this case, I'm talking about race and ethnicity, but you can discriminate against people for all different kinds of things. But for race and ethnicity, if I were to own an apartment building and deny housing to a certain racial group or ethnic group because of the pre-existing biases that I have against them, that's discrimination, right? That is a discriminatory and illegal practice. Prejudice is a little harder because it doesn't always show. It's not an act, it's more of a thought, okay? This was easiest for me to understand in thinking about my biases towards my best friends when I was in college, when I first learned these terms or really understood these terms. But now I can see it when thinking about my children. I am prejudiced about my children. I think they're the most beautiful children that have ever lived. Are they? Well, yeah, that's what I think. But that's a thought in my head, right? That I know is ridiculous. But a lot of parents think that, right? It's not based in any science or fact. It's just a thought. So consider that for racial and ethnic identities. We may have thoughts about other groups that are different from us, or maybe within our own racial and ethnic groups, that we believe X about this group just because we do. And maybe we'll say, well, one time I had an experience with a group that fitted that, or a person that was a part of blank ethnicity. They were this race, and that person did this thing. And then we'll connect that to the whole and say that I think all people in this group do this thing, or are more likely to do that thing, or are better at this, or worse at that. It's all just fabricated. Even things where we think, well, some racial groups, lots of people believe are better at some sports than others. That's cultural and taught. And if if you were born into a different social group where that was not taught, it's not likely that those same skills and talents would just magically appear. And the same could be said for something, that we believe that's negative about another group as well. The only other point here I want to make is when we use the term minorities, we are referring to a group of people that is, usually lower in numbers, meaning they're statistically the minority. They make up less than 50% of the population. And the second piece to that is that they are subordinated or historically subordinated and oppressed by society. So when we're talking about racial and ethnic groups, who would be considered minorities? It would be everyone except people who identify as Caucasian and white. I know that was a mind-blowing fact for me to even though that's kind of well, that makes sense. It's kind of crazy to think about. People who identify as white make up around 70% of the US population. So we are the statistical majority, but we also historically have oppressed and subordinated all other groups, most other groups within the US. Interestingly, women are also considered a minority, although that's not what we're talking about here. Women are considered a minority not in numbers, but in our history of oppression everywhere, but also here in the US. We will get into that in a different chapter. I hope this, the purpose of this was to clear up the difference in those terms, but also kind of get you thinking that what we think we know about race and ethnicity, prejudice, discrimination, those kind of words that, especially now, are just, we use all the time. We may not really know what they mean, or they may mean something deeper than what it appears to be on the surface. I hope that makes sense.